All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. This is Marcy Reedy, Program Coordinator at the University Council for Educational Administration with the UCEA webinar series on educational leadership. Our webinar today features an exciting new UCEA report, A Policymaker's Guide, Research-Based Policy for Principal Preparation, Program Approval, and Licensure. The guide provides policymakers and researchers with a better understanding of which high-leverage, research-based policies for principal preparation and licensure are present in current policy. The report contains individual profiles for the 50 states and DC with an overview of the policy areas for each state. In order to facilitate the development of stronger policies for principal preparation and certification, the report also includes policy examples to consider. We will devote our time this afternoon to a discussion about the high leverage policies identified in the new policy report and just why this data is important for states. Joining us today are three individuals deeply versed in the world of state policy for principal preparation, program approval, and licensure. Dr. Erin Anderson and Amy Reynolds are co-authors of the new policy report and vigorous researchers here at UCEA. Dr. Katy Anthes is Executive Director of the Educator Effectiveness Team at the Colorado Department of Education. So on behalf of all of UCEA, a warm welcome to all three of our panelists.
Thank you, Marcy.
Glad to have you all. To start things off, I thought it would be helpful to get a better understanding of the report at hand. Erin and Amy, the reaction to your new report has truly been outstanding, and the research seems to really be in demand from the states. Can you please take a few minutes to give us an overview of your report and some of your most relevant findings? In particular, perhaps you could tell us more about the high leverage policies you looked for in each state. Erin, could you start us off?
Yes, thank you, Marcy. First, I'd like to give some background on the project. Conceptually, this UCEA project started with the research-based notion that the principal has a significant indirect link to student learning. In order for principals to be effective, they must be prepared for this difficult and multifaceted position. For that reason, UCEA feels candidate preparation and licensure are important aspects of the principal pipeline. Furthermore, we believe that state policy, at least in part, dictates the quality of that preparation. We found that there was a gap in the research describing how principal preparation, program approval, and candidate licensure were legislated in the state statutes, rules and regulations, and accompanying State Board of Education documents. To address these questions, we convened a UCEA expert panel and completed a review of the literature. Through this iterative process, we developed a rubric with policy areas, which are listed here on this slide, and criteria, which will be discussed in detail during this webinar. I'd like to note that where we were lacking evidence in the literature, we relied on practical importance and experience. As the project evolved, we decided to divide the policy areas into high leverage policies more grounded in the literature and regulatory policies more grounded in practical importance. Today, Amy and I are going to discuss the findings for the high leverage and regulatory policy areas. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that if you're interested in more on the full methodology and the development of the rubric, you can check out the article in the December 2015 issue of JRLE. If you don't have access to that journal, feel free to contact us. And if you'd like to see the more detailed findings, you can access the report online on the UCEA website or in print. And if you're interested in a print version, you should just contact us here at headquarters. Before I discuss the high leverage policies, I'd like to mention that the report approaches the data in two primary ways. This report provides data on the total percent of overall rubric criteria met and compares each state to the entire sample. What you're seeing here is an example from Tennessee, which is our maximum, which represents the maximum in both sides of this graph. For instance, Tennessee has enacted the most policies, meeting 15 of the 16 criteria for all 5 principal preparation program approval policy areas, whereas Wyoming only met 1 of the criteria, representing the minimum. Again, Tennessee represented the maximum, meeting 6 of the 7 criteria for candidate licensure, with Wyoming only meeting 2, again representing the minimum. Also in this report, we show how states stack up against other states in the high leverage areas, which we will view in a few slides. Now I'm going to go into detail on the high leverage policies, which we define as policies that have more support in the research base and or practitioner experience for having improved the preparedness and effectiveness of practicing principals. There are 4 high leverage policies from the program preparation program approval rubric, and those are selection, a clinically rich internship experience, a university district partnership, and program oversight. In addition, there's 1 high leverage policy from the candidate licensure rubric, and that is the experience requirement. This graph provides an overview of the distribution of the high leverage policy areas for the 50 states and DC. As you can see, fewer states have met criteria for 4 or 5 of the policy areas, with only 2 states or 4% meeting all 5 high leverage policies, and those are Tennessee and Illinois. And additionally, only 5 states or 10% met 4 of the high leverage policy areas. And then there's a fairly even distribution for states meeting 3 or less policy areas, with nearly a quarter not meeting the criteria for any of the policy areas. For different policy areas, meeting the criteria looked a little bit different. For example, for a more well-developed definition of a policy like the clinically rich internship, states did not have to meet all the 6 criteria to have met that policy area, but instead they have to have met a majority of the criteria. On the other hand, for a policy area like program oversight, where the different criteria don't necessarily stand alone, they had to meet all 4 of the criteria. And you can see the report for the rationale for each of the policy areas. As I mentioned, we compared how the states stacked up by looking at just the high leverage policies. Here you can see 3 examples. In the top corner, from Illinois, you can see that they met all 5 of the high leverage policy areas. In the other corner, you can see Indiana, who has not yet developed policy for all 5 of the high leverage areas. And in the bottom, you can see the state of Delaware that has adopted some of the high leverage policies and not others. In the report, you can see that states meet different areas of this distribution. Now I'm going to discuss the findings for each high leverage policy area and the criteria used to determine if the policy area was present. I will discuss them in order of their prevalence across states. First, we will discuss the experience requirement, which was the most common high leverage policy found in states. In fact, all 50 states and DC mentioned at least 1 of the 3 criteria. As I mentioned, the experience requirement includes 3 criteria. These criteria represent educational as well as professional experience. The criteria most commonly met in this policy area, with 43 of the 51 states having evidence of it, was that candidates had to complete an accredited, approved preparation program. Meanwhile, only 20 states required a master's degree in educational leadership or a closely related field, which we typically defined as a degree in another area of education. In addition to those educational requirements, we observed whether states required teaching experience. 46 states required some school-based experience, with 39 states requiring 3 or more years teaching experience for licensure, with some states requiring up to 7 years experience. We did find a great deal of variation on how teaching experience was defined, with 20 states allowing the school-based experience to be completely out of the classroom in positions such as a school counselor or social worker. Of the states that required classroom teaching experience, 4 required teaching for only a portion of the 3 years. The next most legislated policy area is program oversight. There are 4 criteria for program oversight listed here based on the number of states that met that criteria. 32 states required documentation and or site visits. 30 required an oversight team with relevant experience and training, and 30 required a feedback mechanism. 26 required state review at regular intervals, and typically that was a 5 to 7 year cycle. Of the 37 states that met at least one of the 4 criteria, over half required all 4, suggesting that if policy is present for oversight, it tends to be well developed. Relatedly, 60% of those states that met all 4 criteria specifically mentioned the Council for the Accreditation of Education Preparation, or CAPE, as the specific oversight mechanism. Next, we're going to talk about the clinically rich internship. The clinically rich internship experience has the greatest number of criteria associated with it, with 6 criteria. 30 states met 1 or more of the 6 criteria for a clinically rich internship, and 21 states did not meet any of the criteria for a clinically rich internship. While the internship has the strongest presence in the research, a full 40% of states do not provide legislation for the 6 identified criteria, with only 8% of states meeting all 6 criteria. Of states that met 1 or more criteria, the greatest proportion, or 20%, met 4 out of the 6 criteria. We also found that there wasn't a consistent pattern across states that met several criteria as to which ones were adopted in concert. 2 states, Ohio and New Mexico, simply stated that there must be an internship experience, but did not mention any of the additional requirements. The most commonly legislated aspect of the internship was supervision by an expert veteran, with 25 states meeting that criteria. While the least commonly legislated aspect of the internship was the requirement of 300 plus hours of time in the field, with only 16 states meeting that criteria. 6 states had a requirement for hours in the field that were less than 300, and the number of hours was as high as 800 in one state and as low as 180 in another. The remaining 4 policy criteria deal with the structure of the internship, with between 1/3 and 1/4 of the states adopting each of these criteria. The next high leverage policy, which is not found in 68% of the states, is university district partnerships. The university district partnership is defined for this study using 3 criteria: alignment between district needs and program design, which was found in 16 states, a commitment from the district to provide a clinically rich internship, found in 13 states, and collaborations on selection, found in only 10 states. Of the 16 states that mentioned legislation for university district partnerships, the majority, or 9 states, mentioned all 3 criteria. We do recognize that partnerships can be difficult to form, especially in rural areas, which may limit the number of states that require them. The second finding we emphasized was that the least common high leverage policy was selection, which is an area that research is starting to highlight as an important aspect of principal preparation. The only state to mention both criteria for selection was Tennessee, which had both a targeted recruitment plan and a performance-based assessment. An additional 5 states, Alabama, Illinois, Iowa, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, used what we referred to as a performance-based assessment. 88% of the states did not mention selection or recruitment at all in their policy. This brings us to the end of the discussion of the high leverage policy areas. Next, Amy will talk about the 3 regulatory policy areas and our overall findings from the report.
Thanks, Erin. So Erin provided us with an overview of our findings for high leverage policy areas. Just a brief reminder, those regulatory policy areas that we're about to discuss were areas that we considered to be of practical significance and were also identified by our UCEA panel of experts despite a lack of empirical research. For a full discussion of those topics, again, we refer you to the JRLE paper in the December 2015 issue. And there was just one area considered regulatory policy out of the 5 under principal preparation program approval, which was program standards. And there were 2 of the 3 areas under candidate licensure, including assessment requirements and licensure renewal. So the third finding was that the regulatory policy found in the most states was the existence of program standards, with all 50 states and the District of Columbia having adopted or adapted the ISLIC standards or aligned state-created standards. So here we have a view of the regulatory policy for program standards. The criteria in this rubric was included, required that a state had adopted or adapted leadership standards from a nationally recognized organization. Although the research does show that there's some debate around the use of standards, overall, we found that standards were considered a guide for developing curriculum and field experiences and aligning knowledge and skills of effective leadership with practice. As you can see in the figure here, the majority of the states, 29 of them, at the time our data was collected, had adapted the 2008 ISLIC standards. One of the things we're interested to watch in the coming years is that, of course, this year, the 2015 update of the ISLIC standards, now called the Professional Standards for Educational Leaders, has been completed, and so we're fascinated to see how states react to that. Next is candidate assessment. So there were 2 criteria under candidate assessment requiring the completion of assessments based on national standards, which 34 states required. So candidate assessment, although again, there's not a strong base of research suggesting that it should be a requirement necessarily, it's a practical system for assessing candidate competency before licensure is granted. Nonetheless, recent research by Grissom, Matani, and Blissett may suggest that assessments such as the SLLA don't actually predict leadership success and may serve to limit the candidate pool in terms of both size and diversity, suggesting that a more holistic assessment may be needed to accomplish this task effectively. So this dovetails nicely into our second criteria, which is that the candidate assessment is or includes a portfolio review. However, we only have 6 states showing evidence of policy requiring this step for candidate licensure. And then we have licensure renewal. So there are 2 criteria under licensure renewal, and 46 states mention one or both of these requirements. The first was that it requires renewal with a distinction between license types, which 34 states did. And then additionally, there were 45 states that required continuing education activities. So a majority of the states do require continuing education activities for licensure renewal for principals. However, as with experience requirements, we found a vast amount of variation in this particular feature. So we subdivided this into requirements that we considered to be strong for continuing education versus weak. Our definition for strong requirements was that it included professional development that was tailored to individuals and directly related to the work of a principal. What we found, though, is only about a quarter of those 45 states actually required things in that vein. And so the remainder of the states, nearly 75%, had what we considered weak requirements, where the continuing education requirement policy were simply blanket requirements for professional development or credit hours or a verification of experience. So a brief summary of our findings overall is on our next slide here. So overall, we found that states were more likely to legislate requirements for principal candidate licensure than for principal preparation of program approval, despite the fact that there was more research supporting the features in the preparation program approval rubric. One of the ways we represented this in the report is using a visual depiction of the findings in this map you can see. The approach we took here is to represent the states each as hexagon to avoid some of the visual bias of large Western states and states in the other parts of the country that you may not have been able to see otherwise. We use color shading to represent the proportion of policies present. So on the left, we have principal preparation program approval, and on the right, candidate licensure. In each case, a darker shade corresponds to a greater proportion of the policies in that particular area, whereas lighter represents less. So to round out our findings for this time, regulatory policies are more likely to be legislated than the high leverage policies. And so this leaves a lot of room for development. The high leverage policies found in most states do relate to experience requirements and program oversight. And the two policy areas which are meant to ensure that the quality of candidates being licensed is high enough and that the use of high quality preparation practices in place. So we're hopeful to see growth in these areas across states. And one of the reasons we're hopeful for that actually has to do with a comparison that we recently completed in preparation for today in this conversation with Katy Anthes. Is in 2004, Katy Anthes completed a report for ECS looking at policy requirements for some of the same areas we did. So the comparable policy areas are demonstrated in this table. What you'll notice on the far right-hand side is that anything that is green with an up arrow indicates a change between those 2 years that was an increase. And the ones with the asterisks, I'll draw your attention to, simply mean that that increased value includes Washington, D.C., which was not included in the 2004 report. So something that's of particular note is the largest increase was in alternative pathways, which was something that we actually chose not to focus on in our current report, although we consider it an area that seems to be of high interest and that we'll perhaps go back to the data and do some additional consideration around. There was an increase in 17 states that allowed for alternative pathways for licensure, and this included both pathways for individuals as well as policy that allowed for alternative preparation program providers. And after that, the next highest was the completion of assessments based on standards. And then the others you can see listed as well. So with that, we're actually really excited to hear from Katy Anthes about some of her reflections on the past and present of this work.
Excuse me, hello. So yes, I am actually sick, so this is not my normal voice. So I apologize if I cough a little bit, but was trying to get through this because this is a really important topic, and I was so excited to be asked by UCEA to just talk about, you know, reflections of when I wrote the report, when I was at the Education Commission of the States as sort of a policy researcher that was helping states think through leadership policies. And now I'm on the other side of that coin, being in a state, actually trying to implement those policies and using the reports more as a customer rather than a writer. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about why why I find these types of reports helpful now from my end of the spectrum, which is at the Colorado Department of Education, we're always faced with sort of, because leadership is such a critical part of the pipeline and such a critical part of the education system, how do we continuously improve our policy systems around supporting high quality leaders and getting high quality leaders into all of our districts? So these types of reports, first of all, just offer an objective look across the country around, what are states doing on this, and what are other states doing that maybe, Colorado might be ahead on certain aspects, but Colorado may be, playing catch up on other aspects. And so what these types of reports really help us do is be able to identify the states that have gone down the path prior to us and just call them up and say, hey, how are you guys doing this? How have you implemented it? What did it take? What have you learned from that? So it really helps from an implementer standpoint around, when you get it's one thing to pass a policy at the state level or at the legislature. It's a whole nother thing to implement it at the department level. And so having access to know which states have already done that is super critical. It also sort of gives an external push for, for Colorado, for example, but for all states, to talk to our legislators, to our Board of Education, to our commissioner around, where some of our gaps might be, and saying, hey, look, other states are moving in this direction, and we've got some research to support this direction. We think we should invest some time and resources in looking at that. So that part is really helpful too. It's sort of, it just really helps to have that objective look around what everybody's doing. That previous slide was really interesting, and that from the previous report to the current report, you actually do see that, some of those policies are taking hold, and more states are looking at some of those policies to support leaders. So that's what I really wanted to say there. For example, Colorado specifically, in this report, it's really nicely done because we can quickly hone in on the areas that we haven't spent a lot of time on. For example, the explicit selection process, or the university district partnership. So are there some areas we can focus on? I will also say that even though we have yeses in some of the other columns, we still have work to be done there. So, I think we can always get better at the implementation of our clinically rich internships, the implementation of our program oversight, and so there's always leverage points underneath that this still helps us parse that out and look at where the high leverage points are and where we'd want to focus. So with that, I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much. It was really fascinating to hear both the detailed data-driven research perspective and the practical state perspective side by side, and the interconnections between the two. In listening, there's a couple key questions that came to my mind I'd like to throw out to the panelists. But before I do, I would like to just remind all of the attendees that there is a question function on your GoToWebinar control panel. So at any time, if you have any question for the panelists, please feel free to use that and submit your questions, and we'll certainly be monitoring that. But as we move forward, I'd like to just bring forward a few questions which I think might be interesting. For instance, the Policymaker report defines high leverage state policies for principal preparation, program approval, and candidate licensure as a, quote, policy that has support in the research base and or practitioner experience for improving the preparedness and effectiveness of practicing principals. Erin, would you be able to tell us a bit more about how you determined which policies qualified as high leverage and the process you used to make this determination?
Sure, thank you, Marcy. Well, as you mentioned, there were two primary ways that we made that determination. First, we looked at the evidence that the structures or practices in these policy areas had any influence on the effectiveness of the principal in practice. I should mention here that there's a paucity of research on preparation, on the particular program features that effectively prepare leaders, and on the relationship between preparation and practice. And while we recognize that limitation, we do believe that there has been evidence established that preparation matters and that certain program features are particularly important for effectively preparing future school principals. There are a few seminal studies that compared what they referred to as either exemplary or innovative programs and traditional programs to help try to isolate those program features, such as the Jackson and Kelly study from 2002, the Darling-Hammond et al. Study from 2007, and a series of studies by Terry Orr, including the Orr and Barber study of 2007, a study by herself in 2011, and two studies that she conducted with orphanus in 2011 and 2013. Though the research we determined that the clinically rich internship, university district partnerships, and selection were high leverage policies. In addition, we looked at whether there was evidence in practice that certain structures or practices influence principal effectiveness. And this is where we really made the decision to include both experience and oversight. And for experience, I know there are certain scholars out there making the argument that it's not necessary for a school level building leader to have teaching experience prior to taking that position. But it is our belief that one of the most important things a principal does is instructional leadership. And without having been in the classroom or served in another position in the school, they would not be prepared to lead instruction. And also, most licensed and well-respected professions require some sort of advanced degree. And for oversight, we really felt that programs should be regularly assessing their quality and striving for improvement. And by requiring programs to report on that progress, it helps to ensure that programs are devoting that time to self-assessment and therefore ensures some sort of accountability.
Great, thank you, Erin. That's really interesting as you go through that process. Another question that occurred to me, and would like to address this to Katy. It's been over a decade ago now that you worked with ECS to develop a valuable state-by-state summary of licensure requirements for school administrators. The current report we're discussing builds off that work. Could you talk a bit about why you felt it was important to document the state-by-state data then and how it was used in 2004?
Sure. Yeah, I think one thing we were realizing in 2004, well, not that we were realizing, but a lot more sort of attention started to get paid to the critical role and the linchpin role of the school leader in implementing a lot of the major reform initiatives. Sort of there was this conversation about, you know, we can pass all the policies we want in the states, but if you don't have a high quality, highly effective leader, you know, implementing those policies and collaborating with teachers and developing high quality cultures in buildings and working to think about distributed leadership in buildings and all sorts of things, that many of those reforms would fall flat. So there were a lot of the research, and I think some of which was just mentioned, around, you know, principals are one of the second most important indicators in student achievement out there. And so we really said from ECS's perspective, you know, we need to take a look at what policies are out there on enhancing the quality of school leadership. And so it was really sort of a baseline just to say what's going on out there, what state policies are out there, and then would that illuminate any gaps that researchers could think about, or states could think about, or policymakers could think about. And so that was really the impetus of it. I think we also just know from a public policy perspective that a lot of policy gets introduced and is used just by a diffusion model, meaning that, you know, some states try some things and then other states, you know, look at what those states have done and say, oh, should we try something similar? So just because of that diffusion model of policy development, sometimes we wanted to say, well, it would just be great to identify which states are doing which to kind of develop those informal networks to think about policy development across the country. And then I do think, you know, it was just an awareness piece. Like, if leadership is one of those critical linchpins to making the education system, you know, a continuously improving system, then we should focus on principal policies as much as we focus on teacher policies. And I still don't think we've gotten that sort of equality yet. because we still focus a lot on teachers, and there's a lot of good reasons for that because they're the number one, effect on student achievement. But we all know that teachers are supported by leaders, and they either stay or go based on the quality of the leadership. So if you have a set of high-quality teachers, you definitely want a high-quality leader in that building so that you keep and retain and support those teachers in doing the critical work they do. So yeah, that's a little bit of history there.
Yeah, absolutely. It is very critical. It is very critical. It's fascinating to see all of the development in this area and the research put into it. Certainly very important. One final question, and perhaps we can bring Amy into the discussion. Would like to add in on this, but the report makes the point that less attention has been paid to the internship experience than you might expect, despite the fact that the research base documents its importance. In fact, the report data shows that 40% of states have not met any of the criteria for this high leverage policy. Amy, could you talk about why you feel it's important to focus on this aspect of principal preparation?
Sure, Marcy. So thinking about actually what Katy was just commenting on as well about the importance, the real world importance of having high quality leaders in all school buildings for both the teachers in those buildings and the students as well as the communities, is that the clinically rich internship is really where we consider that preparation meets practice for school leaders who are preparing to fulfill those roles and fulfill them well. And so, as you mentioned, the inclusion of a clinically rich internship is among the most well-supported aspects of principal preparation in the empirical literature, as well as from anecdotal evidence. And it's important to note that the mere presence of an internship in policy or in a program is not quite enough. And so we really emphasize what it means for a program to be clinically rich. And so that's reflected in the rubric by the fact that this particular policy area has 6 criteria. And we were able to discern those 6 criteria because of the greater volume of research available there. And I'm not going to pull in all those specific studies now, but for those who are interested, the full literature review, again, is in that December 2015 JRLE issue where we discuss it at length. But what a clinically rich internship does is it provides an opportunity for integration of knowledge and skills gained in the program. It's on-the-job training, it's authentic, and it's a particularly high quality when it allows for the integration of learning with fieldwork, which is something that needs to be intentionally done with regards to program design. It's also been reported by preparation program completers to be the most valuable part of their pre-service training. And so this is something that, again, as you mentioned, because we've got those 6 different features of what it means to be a clinically rich internship, and it's an area that enjoys such rich support from program completers as well as the literature, is that we'd like to see that 40% of states that currently have policy for none of those 6 areas, we'd like to see that number decrease. And hopefully folks will engage in the kind of practice that Katy was talking about in terms of state level education folks and policymakers engaging in conversation with one another regarding how to make those policies something that works for preparation programs in their states.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Erin, Student Council for Educational Administration.
It also occurs to me as I'm listening to this discussion, and I'll just throw this out to all 3 of the panelists, that considering the impact of ESSA and the devolution of power to the states, how that might impact research of this nature. And, would you say it's fair to say that, that with the new legislation makes it even more important?
Yeah, this is Katy. I do think it's even more important now. And I also think that, so yeah, I mean, that's a simple answer. Definitely more important as states take more control over the policies. But I also like how it's I think this report, much more so than my report, you guys did a much better job you know, separates out all of the detail within each of those major policy criteria, and it highlights, like, even you know, I would say Colorado looks really good on this, and we are good. No, I'm just kidding. But I already, you know, I know some of the things that we have yeses on, but we're still working on, we're still improving, we're still getting better on. And by separating out that detail level is really helpful, just as a kind of a gap analysis for each state to think about.
Great. Amy and Erin, did you guys have any thoughts, or?
Well, you know, we just want to second what Katy said. I mean, this move to putting some of the control back in at the state level is just gonna make the policies that are in the code all that more important. Not that they always weren't, but this will be the policy that the state really turns to. And so it's a really good time, I think, for the report to come out and for states to be able to have a chance to reflect on where they are and where they might need to get to.
Yeah, and I think the other thing it made me reflect on is recently Paul Manna gave a talk about a report that he developed for the Wallace Foundation, and a comment that he made that really stuck with me is the function of states as policy laboratories. And from that perspective, there's a real learning opportunity available for all of us invested in public education, and that this chance for states to have a bit more control over those aspects of education. And of course, here we're talking in particular about leadership preparation. There's an opportunity for innovation and to learn more about what best practice may look like and how policy can support it.
Great. Thank you, guys. There also seems to be some interest expressed on the studies that you mentioned on the alternative paths to licensure. And if anyone has or seeking additional information about that, they're more than welcome to email ucea@virginia.edu, and we'll be happy to provide those references and additional information.
Well, and Marcy, I'll step in there a second. You know, we presented on this data at UCEA in the fall at the UCEA conference, and we heard from a lot of people an interest about alternative pathways to licensure and alternative preparation pathways. And originally we did collect data on this as part of our rubric, and then really took a second to reflect and decided that that wasn't necessarily where it belonged. But we were able to draw a few conclusions. And we found that of the 50 states in DC, 32 have legislation in place to allow for alternative pathways to licensure, which in contrast, 32 states have standards to outline alternative preparation program providers regulations. So there's sort of two ways of looking at alternative licensure, both the actual licensure of the candidate and then the preparation program that they can go through. And so Amy and I are already beginning to dive into this a little bit deeper, and I think we'll probably, hopefully, have a follow-up paper that really just looks specifically at this topic due to the interest in it.
You always know you hit a key topic when you can already start talking about your follow-up paper. So, well, thank you all so much for your time. We'll start to think about final thoughts here. If there are any questions from the audience, please feel free to continue sending those through the question function on the GoToWebinar control panel. But as we move forward, I'd just like to throw it back to Erin and Amy and Katy to see if you have any remaining thoughts.
Well, so, you know, some of my remaining thoughts are that really the purpose of this project was not to evaluate states and give states, you know, a grade on a scale, or, you know, say some states were doing a better job than others. It really was to get a sense of what was going on out there, so that, as Katy mentioned earlier, states could learn from each other, and this process of policy diffusion could be done in a really thoughtful manner. And so what we sort of considered at the end of our report was a call to action. And we saw it as a call to action to UCEA researchers and other researchers to disseminate researchers to policymakers disseminate research to policymakers directly. I think we often think that they're not necessarily going to want to hear what we have to say, but I believe that they do. And that this also provides a tool to guide some decision making around further research in the area of state policy around preparation and candidate licensure. We also think it saw it as a call to action to preparation programs to also communicate with policymakers. I mean, the way that some of these states and some universities have been able to develop really strong partnerships is they've reached out to policymakers and involved them in the process. And also to use this information to improve the program based on the research-based suggestions that we made. And then finally, we're hopeful that policymakers, as I mentioned, will guide the design of future policies to support high-quality preparation using some of the ideas that we had in our report. And one thing that we didn't talk about is for each of the policy areas, we provide policy examples from states that we really found to be exemplar. And even when in those visuals where they were stacking up, if there was an area that we didn't feel like they had met that policy area or met the criteria, we provide a state that they can look to as an example to help develop stronger policy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sounds like a very diverse audience. Amy or Katie, did you guys have anything else you'd like to address?
I am losing my voice quickly, so I'm going to pass.
Oh.
I'll just make one final comment that Erin and I have discussed with Michelle as well, that we do consider this to be an ongoing process and project, and we're definitely open to feedback. And so our main goal was translating our research into something very usable in terms of what the report is. And so if we could improve that in any way, that's something we'd love to hear from folks. And if there's changes in policies or something that slipped our attention, for folks to just please contact us and help us identify where that policy can be located so we can make those changes be reflected in the report. As anyone knows who's gone through any large policy area for 50 states, it's a messy process and things can certainly slip through the cracks.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, with that, we have reached the end of today's webinar on the Policymaker's Guide, Research-Based Policy for Principal Preparation, Program Approval, and Licensure. I'd like to thank each and every one of our guests for joining us today. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Katy, who was a real trooper to persevere despite being under the weather. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees who took their time to join us today and ask a lot of important questions and extended our thinking on this issue. For those who attended today's webinar, I'd like to remind you that a full recording of the webinar will be made available just give us a couple days to get it up there up on the website, ucea.org, and we encourage you to share it. And with that, we will say goodbye, thank you, and wish everyone a very pleasant week.